The child kept pointing at the ceiling and giggling, and when his father removed the ceiling.
Hello everyone. Enjoy these relaxing moments while you watch.
George held his son Leo's hand tightly as the two of them climbed the dim staircase of the old apartment building in the Bronx, New York City. The damp air and the scent of old paint mixed with the metallic tang of rust from the railings made George shudder. The fourth-floor apartment they were about to move into wasn't an ideal choice, but after his wife Martha had died of cancer, George was left with almost no other option. "Are you tired, Leo?" he asked, leaning down to his son. Leo looked up, his big round eyes wide, his black hair tousled. "Not really, Dad. I like the new house. It smells like a ghost movie." George chuckled softly. "A ghost movie? Now you're scaring me." Leo shook his head and whispered, "I'm just kidding." As they reached the fourth floor, an open window slammed against the wall, making George jump. An elderly woman with silver hair called up from the balcony below. "Hello there, new neighbor. Watch out for the wind slamming the windows, this season can be dangerous." George looked down and nodded. "Thank you, ma'am. I'll be careful. I'm Eleanor, I live on the third floor. If you ever need anything, just holler. I'm always around." "Nice to meet you, Mrs. Eleanor," George smiled, then unlocked the door to apartment 4B. The apartment wasn't big, but it was enough: 2 small bedrooms, a living room connected to the kitchen, and an old bathroom. George carried Leo into the boy's room and placed him on the new mattress that had just been delivered. "How's that? Comfy bed?" Leo lay down and looked around. Then suddenly, he pointed at the ceiling and giggled. George frowned. "What's so funny?" Leo didn't respond right away. He kept staring at a corner of the ceiling where there was a yellowish stain. Then he said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world, "He's playing hide-and-seek with me." George stiffened. "Who is?" Leo leaned on his elbow, tilting his head thoughtfully. "The man up there. He crawls on the ceiling, but he only plays at night." George tried to suppress the chill crawling up his spine. "Are you imagining things? Maybe remembering a movie you saw?" "Nope." Leo shook his head firmly. "He said his name is, he hasn't told me yet. But he laughs really loud. He told me, Leo's a good boy. Don't tell your dad, or he'll be mad." George's heart pounded. He struggled to keep his voice calm. "You heard him speak?" Leo nodded, then asked, "Daddy, is it true we're not supposed to tell dads about secrets?" George patted his son's head. "Any secret is safe to tell me. But we'll talk more after dinner, okay?" Leo nodded. George stepped out into the hallway, closed the door, and leaned against the wall. The apartment was silent, with only the faint noise of cars from the street below. "It's just a child's imagination," he told himself. Just his mind acting out after the shock of losing his mom. The first night passed without incident. But on the third night, while George was lying in bed reading, he heard a very faint noise, a brief creaking sound, from the ceiling in Leo's room. He stopped, tilted his head. Silence. Then, another creak. He stood up and quietly walked into Leo's room. The boy was still sleeping, but a strange smile was visible on his face, and his head was turned toward the ceiling where the old stain was. "Leo," George whispered, gently shaking him. "Did you hear anything?" Leo opened his eyes, groggy. "He's playing, keep it down, Dad, he doesn't want you to know." "Did he touch you?" George asked quickly. Leo shook his head. "Just watched. For a long time." The next morning, George went downstairs to buy some coffee. On the way back, he ran into Mrs. Eleanor watering her plants in the hallway. "Your boy is adorable," she said. "But, do you think he's sleeping well? I often hear him talking in his sleep around 3 a.m. George froze. "You hear him too?" "Yeah. A child's voice, talking softly but regularly. Once I heard him laugh and say, "I'm hiding under the bed now." It was cute, but a bit eerie. George thanked her, then hurried upstairs. Doubts began to take shape in his mind. That night, he decided to install a hidden camera disguised as an alarm clock in Leo's room. The first 4 nights showed nothing unusual. But on the 5th night, George reviewed the footage the next morning while Leo was eating toast and milk. The video was 6 hours long, and he fast-forwarded to around 3 a.m. At the 52nd minute, he paused. Something had moved in the top left corner of the frame, near the ceiling. He rewound and played it slowly, his hands trembling. Something emerged from the ceiling. "Oh my God," George whispered. It was a human arm, thin and pale. It slowly pushed out from a ceiling panel, followed by half a human torso slithering down, stopping halfway out of the ceiling. A bald man's face, grinning with bared teeth, pupils barely visible, stared straight down at Leo. George nearly dropped the phone. The child in the footage, Leo, was still fast asleep, unaware. The man or whatever it was stared down for nearly 20 seconds, then climbed back up, the ceiling tile closing behind him as if nothing had ever happened. George jumped to his feet, cold sweat pouring down his back. He turned to his son. "Leo, do you remember what you dreamed about last night?" Leo chewed slower, then whispered, "He said the light was too bright last night, he didn't like it." George immediately climbed on a chair and examined the ceiling. Near one corner, a wooden panel was slightly out of place, with faint scratches along the edge. He grabbed a coat hanger and gently nudged it. The panel popped open. Inside was a narrow crawl space. A musty smell and a faintly metallic stench wafted out. George reached in, feeling around, and found an old camera, the kind used in the early 2000s, with wires leading into the space. He recoiled when he saw beside it a dust-covered external hard drive, and a wooden box tightly bound with wire, part of it stained with what looked like dried, reddish-brown blood. George swallowed hard. There was a small inscription carved into the lid, "For those who sleep well." He placed everything on the table, breathing heavily. His hands trembled as he reached for the wire around the box. Leo stepped out of his room, still drowsy. "Dad," he smiled again today. "He told me not to open the box, he said it's his secret." George tightened his grip, looking at his son, then at the box. He knew, this was no longer just a child's imagination. George locked Leo's room from the outside using a temporary latch he had just installed that morning. He needed a moment to calm down and check the ceiling, something that was no longer just a vague suspicion. "Play with your train set, okay? I'm going to fix the hallway light for a bit," George called out. "Okay, Dad," Leo answered softly, completely absorbed in his wooden train set. George climbed onto a chair and once again removed the wooden panel. Flashlight in hand, he shone it into the suffocating darkness above. The metallic stench was stronger than the night before. He poked his head up, brushing against cobwebs and thick layers of dust. In the corner near the vent, George noticed a faint trail, as if something had regularly crawled across. He reached out to feel it, then froze. Beneath the dust was a small handprint, pressed clearly into the wood. "No way," he whispered. As he examined it, a knock suddenly came from the front door below. George jumped, nearly dropping the flashlight. "Who is it?" he called. "George." "It's me, Eleanor," came the voice of the elderly neighbor from outside the door. "I brought some flan. You still like it, don't you?" George quickly climbed down, adjusted the ceiling panel, and opened the door. "You're too kind, thank you," he said, accepting the box of flan and trying to act normal. Eleanor looked at him for a moment, then lowered her voice. "Tell me honestly, George, is something wrong in there?" George paused for a few seconds. "Why do you ask?" "Because every night, I hear something off. Like someone moving, but not from inside the apartment, from the ceiling. I thought I was just hearing things, but today, when Mr. Matthew from the second floor came to fix the circuit breaker, he said some wires up there looked like they had been tampered with. George hesitated. Mrs. Eleanor, if I tell you, will you promise not to think I've gone crazy? She gave a dry chuckle. I've lived 82 years, dear. Not much can surprise me now. He looked at her, then whispered, I think someone is living in the ceiling. Eleanor's eyes widened, she nearly dropped the box of flan. That night, George couldn't sleep. He sat in front of his laptop, playing an old security video, then fast-forwarded to the part where the ceiling seemed to move oddly. The camera's night vision was faint but clear enough to show slight movements, like something large crawling around. He rummaged through a drawer and pulled out an old hard drive he had found in the ceiling crawlspace. After a few attempts, he finally got it to connect. The interface was simple, but there were dozens of folders. Family Harris 1997. Family Walker 2002. Family Johnson 2006. Each folder was filled with black and white videos, all filmed from ceiling angles looking down at children's beds. George began to shake as he realized, every video was a nighttime recording of small children breathing, turning, quietly sobbing, and occasionally, a shadow passed through the frame. He clicked the most recent folder. Leo_2025. The video was still recording, automatically. This can't be real, he muttered. Leo's voice suddenly called out from the room, Dad. Dad. George rushed in. The boy was sitting upright in bed, eyes wide open. He's up there, Dad. I heard him scratching the ceiling. It's okay, I'm here, George said, pulling him close. But inside, he knew, this was spiraling out of control. The next morning, George called an old friend, Charles Donovan, a structural engineer he had met back when he worked in interior design. Charles, do you have time to stop by? I need someone to check if there's something off with the ceiling structure here. What floor? Which building? Charles asked. 4th floor, 17, Belmont Avenue. There was a long pause on the other end. You're in that apartment? What? That building had some issues years ago. There were rumors, petty thefts, and then a missing child. Police never found signs of a break-in. The case went cold. George shivered. Can you come? I'll be there this afternoon. At exactly 4 p.m., Charles arrived. Tall and lean, wearing glasses, he brought a full toolbox. As he stepped into Leo's room, he looked up and frowned. There's a smell, like rust and damp. George nodded. I think someone's living inside the ceiling structure. Charles used his flashlight, then climbed up to check. A while later, he poked his head back down, his face pale. George. I just found a piece of fresh bread. And an old photo, of a child, face unclear, but it's dated, 2006. George stood frozen. There's more, Charles swallowed hard. Footprints. Very clear. Someone's been crawling across the beams for a long time. And there's a pipe passage that's not on any blueprint. Could it be, he's been living up there the whole time? Charles looked at him. With some basic skills and a decent ventilation setup, it's possible. That night, George didn't sleep. He sat by the window, gripping a small crowbar, a tool he got from his friend Julian, a retired detective. George hadn't called Julian yet, but he knew, time was running out. 2:57 a.m. Leo began to moan. George went to his son's side and pulled back the blanket. The boy was drenched in sweat, murmuring over and over, he said if I'm good, he'll film me, tomorrow, tomorrow. George held him tight. From the ceiling, a loud creak echoed. He looked straight up. A wooden panel had shifted, revealing a narrow gap. A chill raced down George's spine. He whispered, if you're still up there, I'm going to drag you out. Leo suddenly opened his eyes and pointed at the ceiling. He's listening to you, Dad. George followed his son's finger. That dark gap, it looked like it just blinked. George barely slept all night. He sat by his son's bed, crowbar in hand, eyes locked on the ceiling. That small gap where the panel had once shifted now looked like a gaping mouth, breathing. Every creak of wood, every faint shift above made his heart seize. At dawn, Leo woke with dark circles under his eyes. He rubbed them and looked at George, who sat silently by the window. "Did you not sleep, Dad?" Leo asked. "No. I stayed up to make sure you slept well." Leo nodded sleepily, then whispered, "He stared at me for a long time, Dad. I saw him last night. He has a big smiling mouth and no hair." George turned sharply. "Are you sure?" Leo nodded again. "I'm sure." George stood up, took his phone, and opened the hidden camera app he had installed in Leo's room. He had replaced the old camera after discovering the previous one in the ceiling had been tampered with. The new camera had ultra-clear night vision and automatically backed up footage to the cloud. He quickly skimmed through last night's footage, focusing on the usual hour, 3 a.m. Minute 46. 47, then. Movement. From the very corner of the ceiling above Leo's bed, a panel slowly shifted. Out of the darkness, a human face emerged. Deep hollow eye sockets, a wide, stretched grin, and ghostly white eyes with no pupils. Half a skeletal body crept out silently, like a giant spider. The figure paused halfway, staring directly down at Leo exactly as George had seen in the old videos. "No, this can't be real," George whispered, his hands trembling. On the video, Leo remained asleep, but a faint smile appeared on his lips as if he felt the gaze. The figure stayed there for nearly 20 seconds, then slowly retreated and gently closed the ceiling panel. George shot to his feet and yelled, "Son of a bitch!" Leo startled. "Dad! What's wrong?" "It's nothing, sweetheart. Daddy's just tired. Go eat breakfast, okay?" George called Julian, his close friend from college, now retired after more than 20 years as an FBI investigator. "Julian, please come to my place. It's urgent." "George. What's going on? You sound like you're in the middle of a war zone." "It's serious. You'll understand when you get here. Bring a hard drive reader if you have one." 2 hours later, Julian arrived. His hair was graying, his face stern but his eyes still sharp. After hearing a brief summary and watching the video, he turned pale. "Holy Christ," Julian dropped into a chair. This isn't a joke. "You believe me now?" George asked. Julian nodded. "I do. And I'm afraid you've stumbled on something the police never wanted to revisit." "What do you mean?" Julian sighed and pulled out his laptop. "Give me that old hard drive you found." George handed him the dusty black drive. Julian connected it and began scanning the contents. "Here it is. Jesus, there are hundreds of videos. Look at the folder names. Harris family, Walker family, Johnson family, all names of families who had missing kids, all unsolved cases." George clenched his fists. "Don't tell me they were all filmed from the ceiling like that." "They were. This is a sophisticated setup, installed long ago, possibly more than 20 years. The terrifying part is that everyone thought he vanished, but he's still up there, living in the ceiling, crawling through ducts and maintenance shafts." Julian opened the last folder, Leo_2025. The video was still recording, the timestamp updating in real time. "Do you see this?" George pointed. "It's still recording, which means he's still here." Julian looked up, his face grave. "We have to act now. But calling the police isn't easy, not without a clear face, no DNA, and no one's going to believe someone lived in the ceiling this long. So what do you suggest?" We catch him. Tonight. We set a trap. George temporarily sent Leo to stay with Mrs. Eleanor, explaining it as electrical repairs in the house. Please watch Leo for me tonight. It might be a bit late. Eleanor smiled warmly. It's no trouble. Such a sweet boy. He told me, I'm not sleeping at home tonight because Dad has an appointment with the man in the ceiling. She chuckled, unaware of the weight of her words. George gave a tight smile, then returned home. Julian prepared a simple trap, a hidden infrared night vision camera under the blanket, and a strobe light setup to disorient any watcher. George gripped a crowbar, sitting by the window, waiting for the familiar hour. 2:58 a.m. George didn't move. 2:59. A faint creak from the ceiling. George tightened his grip on the crowbar. 3 o'clock. The ceiling panel began to lift. A thin, bony hand emerged, groping downward. Julian, he's here, George whispered into the walkie-talkie. No response. Julian. George whispered again. Still silence. Clank. A sharp noise from inside the ceiling, probably a wire being pulled. Then. Half a body lowered down. George's eyes locked with the same white, lidless ones. The thing grinned wide, unblinking. Shoo, it whispered in a chilling voice. We're playing. George screamed and lunged. But in a flash, the figure pulled itself back up. The panel slammed shut. Gone, like it had never been there. George smashed the ceiling with the crowbar. Come out. Come out, you bastard, he shouted. A faint, eerie giggle echoed back. Then silence. The front door burst open. Julian ran in, breathless. Sorry. I lost signal. But I heard everything through the backup audio feed. We recorded it all. Enough to take to the FBI. George collapsed into a chair, gasping, drenched in sweat. He looked at the ceiling again. The gap was sealed, but George knew, it was watching. George sat there, breath heaving, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. The air in the apartment felt heavier than ever. Julian stood at the doorway, pale from what he had just witnessed. We got footage, but not the face, George whispered. That's okay, Julian replied, his voice low. At least we have proof of movement, of a physical presence. The FBI can't ignore this now. George shook his head. No. I can't wait. I have to know who he is and why he's doing this. I have to open the box. Julian looked up. What box? The wooden one in the ceiling. I haven't dared to open it, but now I must. George climbed onto the chair and pulled the panel away once more. The reddish-brown wooden box lay deep inside the crawlspace, tied with rusted wire. He reached in, threading his fingers through the wire, pulling gently, cutting his skin in the process. Damn it, he muttered. Julian pulled out a utility knife and carefully cut the wire. George sat down on the floor and placed the box between them. The flashlight beam swept slowly over the grain of the old, scratched wood. Carved on the lid, in faint English letters. For those who don't cry. Shit, Julian whispered. George took a deep breath and opened the box. A rotten, moldy stench burst out immediately, like long-forgotten garbage or death itself. The first thing they saw. A lock of a child's hair. Brown, soft, tied with a pink thread. Julian swallowed hard. That's. George didn't respond. He lifted the lock, and beneath it. A small plastic bag containing human fingernails, some still stained with dried blood. Julian clenched his jaw. Dear God. Next were two baby teeth, one with dark red blood still clotted at the root. And at the very bottom, a newborn's swaddling cloth, stained with unmistakable, dried dark brown blood. This isn't some symbol or scare tactic, Julian said. He's collecting trophies. George's hands trembled as he brushed aside the last layer of cloth. There, lying flat at the bottom of the box, was a small leather notebook, its corners torn and cracked. There was no name, just scribbled black ink in a childlike scrawl. The Third Eye. He opened the first page. The handwriting inside was messy, written in pencil, some words pressed so hard they dug into the paper. I like hearing them breathe while they sleep. The ones who cry too much must be quiet. Must be quiet. They don't know I'm watching. They think it's just a dream. New family has little Leo. Obedient. Easy to manage. Julian flipped to the next page, lips tightly pressed. I can wait. 10 years, if needed. No light. Just the breathing. Children are angels when they sleep. They won't fight back if I'm gentle. George finished reading and clenched the notebook. I'm ending this tonight. Julian raised a hand. Hold on. We need a system. I'll lift fingerprints, check them against old databases. We might find out who he is. Who do you think he is? Julian glanced around the room, then lowered his voice. There was one name that used to come up. But there was never enough evidence. Alan Martin. Alan Martin. George frowned. That name sounds familiar. Julian nodded. Building systems engineer. He designed the ventilation system for this place nearly 20 years ago. Rumors were he spied on kids with homemade cameras. Police raided his house, but found nothing. Then he vanished. Case was closed. George gasped. You think he never left the building? Julian's jaw clenched. Exactly. Leo was brought home around noon. George tried to act normal, but the exhaustion was plain in his eyes. Dad, he didn't say anything today, Leo murmured. Maybe he's tired, George replied, forcing a weak smile. Leo looked down and whispered, he was writing something in his notebook and looking at me. He said, it's almost time to really play. No more dreams. George turned to Julian, who was sitting in the kitchen scanning fingerprints with a mobile device. You heard that, right? Julian nodded. Every word. That evening, they checked the ceiling system one last time. Julian crawled up, using a flashlight to inspect the beams. Near a utility pipe, he discovered a small wooden door almost invisible. There's something behind this, he called down. George climbed up, holding the light. As he opened the hidden door, a narrow crawlspace appeared, just large enough for a grown man to pass through. A foul stench wafted out, like a long-dead animal. Julian shone the light inside. Dried blood, a lot of it. They filmed it, took photos, then climbed back down. Julian looked at George. He's been living here. For 7 years, maybe more. And he's still planning something with my son, George said, face like stone. Julian slowly nodded. We need to be ready. Tonight won't be surveillance anymore. It'll be confrontation. George placed a hand on his friend's shoulder. I won't let anything happen to Leo. That night, George said to Leo. Can I sleep next to you tonight? Leo nodded. Okay. But he won't like it. He only wants me. George swallowed hard. You don't have to worry. I'll be right here. The room was silent. The nightlight cast a soft glow on the ceiling. George lay beside his son, one hand holding the crowbar, the other resting on Leo's chest, feeling each small, steady breath. Close to 3 a.m., the ceiling began to creak. Leo gripped George's hand. He's here. George didn't blink. The wooden panel trembled slightly, then again, a little more. Leo squeezed George's hand tighter under the blanket. Above them, the ceiling creaked softly, like someone shifting slowly inch by inch in a tight space. George tightened his grip on the crowbar, eyes locked on the ceiling, hands still on Leo's chest, feeling the gentle rhythm of his breathing. "Dad," Leo whispered. "I'm here," George replied, never looking away. "I can hear him breathing. He's really close." George nodded. "So can I." 3:01 a.m. One corner of the ceiling quivered. Clack. A wooden nail came loose and dropped to the floor, spinning in a circle. "Don't move," George hissed through gritted teeth, flashlight at the ready. The crowbar in his hand felt like molten steel. Then the wooden panel lifted slightly. A ghostly white eye peered through the gap, then quickly withdrew. No voice. No crawling sounds. Just that chilling presence. George didn't turn on the light. He didn't scream. He only whispered. "I see you now, Alan." The next morning, Julian returned with the fingerprint analysis. "It's a match," he said, setting the device on the table. One partial print from the notebook matched an old file, Alan Martin, born 1973. Former electrical and systems engineer for high-rise maintenance in New York City. Disappeared in 2018 after being accused of possessing illegal surveillance equipment. "No conviction?" George asked. Julian shook his head. "Not enough evidence. He used to live in this very Unit 4B. Then moved out and vanished. No one realized, he never actually left." George let out a bitter laugh. "So he's been living above us all these years." Julian opened his laptop. "I backed up the entire hard drive. You need to brace yourself." He scrolled through the folder list, each one named after a family and a specific year. Family Harris _ 1997. Family Walker _ 2002. Family Johnson _ 2006. Family Moore _ 2011. Family Clark _ 2015. Julian spoke quietly. "Each folder matches a family who lived in this building with children. None of them are in contact with authorities anymore. Every year, at least one child went missing around here." George clicked on one at random, Family Clark _ 2015. A black and white video appeared. A little boy was asleep, in a room nearly identical to Leo's. Static buzzed softly. Then a dark figure crawled down from the ceiling, silently placing a hand on the child's forehead. George stepped back from the screen. He filmed all this, like some sick collection. Julian nodded. He called them his visual journals. No one knows how long he's been archiving. And each folder ends with a special video. "What kind of video?" George asked. Julian opened Family Walker _ 2002, scrolled to the bottom. The file was titled, "No More Children Left." They watched. An empty room. An empty bed. No furniture. Just a yellowed wall, and a faint, dried bloodstain. No sounds. No people. Just, utter silence. "Every folder ends like that," Julian said. "And the newest one is," he scrolled again, "Leo _ 2025. George's hands clenched. "Open it." The first video appeared, Leo playing with his train set. The ceiling camera recorded his every movement. The second video, Leo sleeping. The footage paused 3 times, each time showing faint movement in the ceiling. The third video, Leo mumbling something in his sleep. George put on headphones and rewound. He said, "If I'm good, I'll get to go to the real room, not the fake one anymore." Julian pulled out the headphones. There's no doubt now. He wasn't just spying. He was communicating with them. George slumped down, burying his head in his hands. I can't believe my son was about to become his next victim." Julian placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's not too late. But you need to stay sharp." George nodded. "We're ending this. No more recordings. No more real playroom. I want him gone. That afternoon, George took Leo to a park near the Hudson River. He wanted his son to breathe, to laugh before things spiraled any further. Are you feeling better? George asked as Leo pushed his toy car through the sand. Yes, but he doesn't like sunlight. He said the light hurts his eyes. George turned to him. He told you that? Since when? Leo looked down. Since the first day. When I drew a picture of him, he told me to tear it up. He said he doesn't have eyes, and if I draw them wrong, he gets sad. George held his breath. Do you still have that drawing? Leo nodded. Under the pillow, in the bedroom. At home, George found the drawing. A man with no eyes, a smile stretched ear to ear, crawling across the ceiling, with oversized hands reaching down toward a child's face. Below it, Leo had scribbled in red crayon. Good boy. Gets to play. Don't tell Daddy. Julian looked at the picture and stood up. You're not sleeping in that room tonight. I'll keep watch. George shook his head. No. Tonight, we lure him out. Julian stared at him. You sure? I'm sure. Tonight will be the last video. But this time, it'll be the one where he's dragged into the light. That night, George didn't sleep. He sat at the kitchen table, the yellow light casting long shadows over the twisted notebook they'd found in the ceiling box. Julian was in the corner, cross-referencing police databases, his face tight with focus. Anything new? George asked, eyes still fixed on the ragged handwriting. Julian nodded slightly. Full identification confirmed. Alan Martin. Full name, Alan Martin Green. Born 1973, from Albany, New York. Orphaned early. Raised in a state home. Adopted at age 9, but later reported his adoptive parents missing when he was 16. Missing parents? George frowned. Nobody investigated? Julian replied, they did. No bodies, no evidence. He claimed they ran away. Case was closed after 3 months. At 18, he enrolled in a technical university in New York City. Brilliant student. Designed utility duct systems for several old buildings including this one. George exhaled slowly. And that's when he started spying. Right. First suspected in 2016, when a mother found a hidden camera in her daughter's room. Alan was brought in for questioning, but no evidence turned up. Then he vanished. Declared missing in 2018. George tapped the table. So all that time, he was living inside the very system he designed. Julian turned his laptop toward George. Look at this blueprint. It's an old floor plan of the building. Alan created a hidden auxiliary duct system connecting the 4th and 5th floors. With a few panels removed, it's navigable for a human. George's jaw clenched. He planned this. This wasn't chance. He chose the 4th floor because it gave him ceiling access, had fewer tenants, and most were single-parent homes. Julian nodded. There are 5 apartments on the 4th floor. Over 20 years, 4 of them had children and all of them had incidents. Police never connected the dots because the files were scattered. George slammed the table. And now Leo's next. Julian sat down, eyes locked on George. I've forwarded everything to a contact at the FBI. But reopening Alan's case will take time. Tonight, we're still on our own. George stared into space. Do you think he'll come out again? He will. He's put his life into this. And Leo. Leo's his final piece. Leo sat in the living room, coloring a picture. George sat beside him, gently asking. What are you drawing, buddy? I'm drawing the new playroom, Leo said, pointing to a large room filled with dark square panels. What playroom? Mr. Allen said, "It has padded walls. No windows. No sound. But lots of teddy bears. And a really big camera." George froze. "When did you first hear his name?" Leo furrowed his brow. "Last night. He told me to say his name. He said if I got it right, he'd open the door to the real playroom." Julian walked in just in time to hear that last part. "We have confirmation," he said. "It's Alan. And if he's teaching Leo to say his name, it means he's gotten dangerously close." George looked at his son. "Leo, I want you to stay with Mrs. Eleanor tonight, okay? You can play with her dog." Leo nodded. "But, if I'm not home, Mr. Allen will be sad." George shivered. "That's okay. He won't get the chance to be sad anymore." That night, Julian and George set up a simple trap, a new hidden camera, a pressure sensor beneath Leo's bed, and a nylon tripwire rigged to a light alarm. They arranged the bed as usual, placing a life-sized doll under the blanket. The room lights were off, save for a dim nightlight. They sat in the living room, eyes fixed on the laptop screen. 2:53 a.m. Leo's room remained still. 2:57. A slight movement in the upper corner of the ceiling. Julian pointed. "Get ready." 2:59. The panel flipped open. A bald head, half a face, slithered downward. George tightened his grip on the crowbar. 3 o'clock. The alarm blared. The motion sensor tripped. Lights exploded to life. But the intruder recoiled instantly like a phantom. The panel slammed shut. Silence. Julian shouted, "Go." They rushed in, climbed up, yanked the panel. Inside, only a charcoal drawing, crudely scrawled and pinned to a wooden beam. "Thanks for the spotlight. Now it's my turn to play." Julian stood frozen. "He knows our plan. He's been watching us." George smashed the ceiling with the crowbar. "He's playing a twisted game. And we're already one step behind." The next morning, George took Leo to preschool. On the way home, he stopped to buy a new lock, a motion detector, and insulated wire cutters. Eleanor saw him in the lobby and approached with concern. "You still haven't caught him?" George shook his head. "I'm close, ma'am. Very close." She looked at him, then said quietly, "Yesterday the boy said something that gave me chills. He said, 'Dad's setting a trap, but Mr. Allen doesn't need to come down. He'll invite Dad up to play.'" George stood frozen. That night, as George stepped into Leo's room for a final check, he found a small slip of paper tucked under the pillow. The paper was old, stained, written in shaky blue ink. "If you want to find me, come to apartment 5C. Leo is ready. We just need the father's agreement." Julian read it, his face turning pale. "Apartment 5C has been abandoned for 10 years. No one's lived there." George gritted his teeth. "But he lives there. Or he's using it, as his final ritual site." Julian nodded. "Tomorrow night. We go up. And we end this." Apartment 5C was at the end of the 5th-floor hallway. A rusted iron door, padlock covered in dust and cobwebs. George stood before it, crowbar in hand, staring at the faded number plate. Julian stood beside him, holding a high-powered flashlight. "You're sure he's in there?" Julian asked quietly. George nodded. "That note wasn't Leo's. He couldn't write like that. Alan wants me here. So I'm coming." Julian took a deep breath. "I'll be right behind you." George jammed the crowbar into the lock. Crack. The lock snapped. The door creaked open with a long, bone-chilling groan. Inside was a nearly empty apartment. The floor was thick with dust, but smeared with drag marks and footprints circling the room. Every pass of the flashlight sent dust into the air, revealing a grotesque world. The main wall was plastered with pictures of children, black and white, color, hand-drawn. All tiny faces. Some were crossed out in red ink. Some were framed with flowers. "Oh my God," Julian whispered. "This is the victim list," George said, eyes scanning the photos. "The children He couldn't finish the sentence. In the center of the room was an old, stained mattress. Next to it, a vintage video camera still powered on. On the table sat a half-open photo album, and beside it, a blind teddy bear. Julian flipped through the album. Inside were printed stills from video footage, each showing a child sleeping, crying, being touched by a bony hand. The last page held a photo of Leo sleeping, face peaceful. Below it, a handwritten note. "Tomorrow night. Complete. Final." "Son of a bitch," George growled, gripping the crowbar. From the corner of the room came a faint rustling sound like a rat, but every man in that room recognized it. It was the sound of a human body brushing against the wall. George pointed his flashlight into the dark corner. "Come out," he shouted. No answer. Julian stepped forward. "Careful, he might." Bang! A heavy object dropped from the ceiling, landing just a meter away from them. It was a rag doll, its neck tied with electrical wire. Pasted on its chest was a piece of paper. "Who watches the children while they sleep?" "It's you." Julian whispered, "He knows we're here." "And he's playing the final game," George said. "Not tomorrow night. Tonight." As soon as they returned to apartment 4B, George felt something was wrong. "Leo," he shouted, opening the door to his son's room. No response. Julian rushed over. "Where's Mrs. Eleanor?" "She's gone. She said she'd watch him." In the bedroom, the window was slightly open. The wind blew the curtains wildly. A small note was taped next to the window. "Rooftop. Hurry. Or it'll be too late." George screamed, "He's got Leo." Julian pulled an old handgun from his hip, the same one he'd kept since retiring. "We're going up. Now. No time to waste." The rooftop was a dark, windswept space. The moon was hidden behind clouds, casting only a pale, sickly glow. Leo stood in the center, wearing his pajamas, hands tied with electrical cords, mouth sealed with duct tape. Behind him stood an old iron bed frame, propped up like a laboratory table. A figure crept out from behind the water tank. Alan. Bald head, emaciated body, skin pale like a corpse. His eyes were rolled back white, his grin twisted between menace and madness. "Shoo!" he whispered. "Don't ruin the game." George roared, "Let go of my son." Alan tilted his head, still smiling. "Leo's been so good. Not like the others who cried. I like the ones who don't fight back." Julian shouted, "Alan Martin. You're surrounded. Take your hands off the boy." Alan laughed. "Surrounded? It's just me here." And silence. He placed a hand on Leo's shoulder. George took a step forward, growling, "Don't touch him." Alan turned to George. "You're the father. You left him to sleep alone. You got tired. You sighed when he asked. You gave him to me." "Shut your mouth," George hissed. "You're like the rest. Pretending to care, but leaving them alone." "I wasn't alone. I was with them. Right above them." Alan yanked the cord. Leo collapsed onto the concrete. George lunged forward. Bang! A gunshot rang out. Julian had fired. Alan stumbled, hit in the shoulder. He screamed, then dashed toward the fire escape. "Stay with Leo!" Julian shouted. George held his son. Leo. Can you hear me? Leo nodded faintly, tears spilling from his eyes. Dad. It's okay now, son. It's okay. Julian chased after Alan, but the sick man slithered into a maintenance shaft like a rat. His voice echoed from within the ceiling. We're not done. I'll come back. I always come back. George called the police, clutching Leo tightly. This time, the signal was clear. 911, what's your emergency? Alan Martin, the fugitive. He's at 17, Belmont Avenue. He just kidnapped my son. That man died in 2018, the operator replied. No. He never left the building. I have proof. He's been living in the ceiling, in the maintenance system between floors 4 and 5. Send a SWAT team now. Transferring you to field dispatch. George held Leo close, looking up at the night sky. Light rain had begun to fall. Julian returned, panting. He vanished. But this time, we're not letting go. George nodded. Even if I have to tear this whole building apart, I will find him. Leo shivered and whispered, Dad, he hasn't left. I saw his eyes, looking down from the ceiling, right now. George screamed and swung the crowbar straight at the man's head, knocking him down unconscious. The clang of metal against skull echoed dry and sharp. Alan shrieked in pain, then tumbled backward, crashing into the wall near the emergency exit. He collapsed onto the concrete rooftop floor, unconscious, blood seeping from his temple. George panted, hands shaking. He tossed the crowbar aside and rushed to embrace Leo. Son. You're safe now. Dad's here. Still bound, Leo collapsed into George's shoulder, trembling all over. He sobbed, Dad. I was so scared. Julian stepped forward, quickly cutting the cords and tearing the tape off the boy's mouth. We need to get him checked by medics right away. And as for him. He glanced at Alan, lying there like a corpse. We're not letting him disappear again. George nodded, picked up his son and ran down the stairs, leaving Julian to guard the sick man. 17 minutes later, sirens wailed through the night in New York City. 3 police cruisers and an ambulance parked outside the apartment building. George, wrapped in a blanket with Leo in his arms, stepped out from the ground floor, his face numb, but his eyes burning with fury. Captain Sarah Thomas approached. Who called in the report on Alan Martin? I did. George pointed toward the building. He's not dead. He's been living in our ceiling for 7 years. I have video, logs, witnesses. And now he's unconscious on the rooftop. Sarah frowned. A whole police unit confirmed his suicide. We have a death certificate. Julian stepped forward from behind, flashing an old badge. That man never died. You all closed the case because there wasn't enough proof. But I've been tracking him since 2006. And now I've got it. And who are you? Sarah asked. Julian Carter. Lieutenant, Juvenile Crimes Division, retired in 2019. I've got the hard drive, images, and his full journal. He recorded everything. Every child. Every night. Every breath. Sarah looked at George, then at Leo. The boy is my son. And nearly his next victim. Sarah nodded. Take me to the rooftop. 3 police officers climbed to the 5th floor and then up the iron stairs to the rooftop. Alan was still unconscious, his hands zip-tied. A paramedic checked his vital signs. Still breathing, the nurse said. Weak pulse but stable. No severe cranial trauma. Sarah stepped closer, studying Alan's face, pale, aged, but with a faint smile still curled at the corners of his lips as if he was satisfied for having made it this far. Put him on the stretcher. Transfer him directly to the psychiatric ward under 24/7 armed guard. "I don't want this man disappearing ever again," Sarah ordered. An officer asked, "Captain, should we search the unit he was living in?" "Search all of floors 4 and 5. Especially the ceiling. Check every plank, every crawl space. He might have set traps or hidden more evidence." 3 days later, the case exploded across the news. Front page headlines blared. "Phantom on the ceiling, crimes hidden for 7 years in the heart of New York City." The evening news aired footage from the ceiling, narrow tunnels, marks from knees dragging, barefoot footprints, rotting food, children's hair and scraps of fabric stained with dried blood. Between the maintenance level and the rooftop, the FBI discovered a disguised cold storage unit. After prying off the metal cover, police found 5 decomposed children's bodies, still identifiable through DNA. Standing before the cameras, Sarah spoke. "We've uncovered undeniable evidence. Alan Martin was not just a voyeur. He was a serial killer, operating a highly sophisticated plan spanning 2 decades. He knew how to use the building's infrastructure to hide. And he succeeded until a father chose to fight back." The camera shifted to George holding Leo. He said nothing, just clutched his son tighter. On the day of the trial, George stood before the New York City Criminal Court, beside Julian and Sarah. Inside the courtroom, Alan was wheeled in within a special containment cage he had bitten a detective the week before. George whispered, "He's lived too long already." Julian nodded. "But this time, there's no ceiling crawlspace for him to hide in." The prosecution presented 16 charges, 5 counts of murder, 7 counts of illegal surveillance and storage of child imagery, 3 counts of kidnapping, and 1 count of assaulting a law enforcement officer. When his attorney requested that Alan represent himself, Alan laughed. "They loved me. They weren't scared. They slept soundly because I was above, watching. You're the ones who abandoned them." The courtroom fell into silence. The judge's gavel slammed like thunder. "Defendant, be silent." Alan stared straight at George and smiled. "You're a good father. You pulled him away just in time. But you'll lie awake, for the rest of your life. Because you know. I still exist, in every creak in the ceiling, every 3 a.m. night." George said nothing. He stood up and carried Leo out of the courtroom, never looking back. Julian followed. "Why'd you leave?" "No need to listen anymore. I know he'll never change. But me. I won't let him haunt my son ever again. Never." 6 months passed since that horrific night on the rooftop. New York City had shifted from January's icy winds to spring's gentle sun. Apartment 4B now had new tenants, but George and Leo were long gone. They had moved to a small house in North Carolina, near the Appalachian Mountains. No more sirens, no more creaking ceilings, no more night terrors making Leo scream in his sleep. Only nature, birds, and fresh air each morning. That morning, George sat on the porch, holding a mug of hot coffee, eyes following Leo pedaling across the red brick yard. "Dad! Look at me!" Leo shouted, waving. "Careful on that turn, don't go too fast." George laughed, eyes never leaving his son. Leo was different now. Still Leo, but his eyes were brighter, no more dark circles from sleepless nights. He could sleep through without bolting awake in fear. He could laugh, talk, and never once mention that man in the ceiling. It was all thanks to Anna, a child psychologist from New Mexico. She had been with Leo for 6 months, 2 sessions a week. The first time she met George, she said, "You'll need patience. Leo isn't just a traumatized child. He was watched, threatened, manipulated by something even adults struggle to believe exists." "That's why I never leave him alone anymore," George replied. Anna nodded. "Good. But what matters most is teaching him to face it, not just avoid it." During the final therapy session, Anna asked Leo, "If you ever see that man again, what will you do?" Leo stayed quiet for a moment, then said. I won't talk. I'll run to the light. Because the light hurts him. Anna smiled. You're very smart. And very brave. One April afternoon, George took Leo into town for groceries. They stepped into a small bakery, and the shopkeeper, Mrs. Rosa, greeted them with a wide smile. George. Leo. What are we having today? Rye bread and a croissant, George answered. And a hot cocoa for my little warrior. Leo beamed. And a tiny cupcake, if Dad says yes. George pretended to frown. More sugar. All right. Because today you're my #1 champ. Mrs. Rosa asked, something special happen? Leo proudly declared, I slept alone 3 nights. Without any lights on. Mrs. Rosa clapped. Bravo. That's amazing. George sat by the window, watching his son happily dig into his pastry. He closed his eyes for a moment. No more blood. No more whispering. No more Alan in the night. Only Leo, sunlight and a child's laughter. That night, George stored his late wife's old suitcase in the attic. When he opened it, he found their wedding photo taken at St. Patrick's Cathedral. Martha, in her white dress, beamed with joy. He gently stroked the photo and whispered. See, love. Leo's okay now. He made it. And I'm still here. For all 3 of us. Suddenly, Leo called from his room. Dad. I finished my drawing. George closed the suitcase and came down. Leo handed him the picture, a crayon sketch, simple but full of life, a small house in a valley, with the sun, pine trees, and 3 people standing together, a tall man, a woman with long hair, and a little boy. This is you, Mom, and me, Leo explained. And the little dog in the corner? George pointed. That's mine. I'm asking for a dog for my next birthday. George laughed. Big or small? Medium. But one that can guard the ceiling. He hugged his son, and tears welled up in his eyes. Leo looked surprised. Dad, what's wrong? Nothing, kiddo. I just feel really lucky. A week later, George received a letter from the FBI. The envelope was thick, stamped red. Inside was the final report on Alan Martin. The last line, bolded. The court sentences Alan Martin to life imprisonment without parole, with mandatory lifelong psychiatric supervision. His recordings and journals have become key evidence, closing 5 child disappearance cases spanning 20 years. Julian called shortly after. Did you read it? I did, George replied. He'll never see the light again. Julian was silent for a moment, then said. It all started in the ceiling. And it ended there. You did good. George gave a soft laugh. I'm just a dad. Doing what had to be done. No, you dragged a rotting system into the light. Not everyone has the courage to face the monster in their own house. George looked up at the ceiling. No more cracks. No more shadows. Just soft light, reflecting off Leo's painting. A roof. A family. A sky with nothing looking down. A few months later, they threw a birthday party for Leo. 10 kids from his new school came to celebrate. George prepared cake, balloons, and one special gift. After Leo blew out the candles, George knelt down and placed a box in front of him. Go ahead, open it. Inside was a light brown puppy wearing a red scarf. What will you name him? George asked. Leo thought for a moment, then said. Light. Light? Because light always chases the dark away. And he'll never let anyone crawl onto the ceiling again. George hugged his son tight. I promise. The darkness will never return. This story reminds us that apathy, denial, and silence can be the soil where evil grows. Children need to be listened to, protected, and loved without condition. Even if darkness exists right under our own roof, the light of love, courage, and belief can banish it. A father who dares to confront evil doesn't just save his child, he breaks the silence that lasted decades. Never ignore the signs.
If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to keep bringing heartwarming stories almost every day. We are very grateful for your support. See you soon.